Hello, and welcome to the third presentation of the Spring 2014 season of the Medical History Interest Group. My name is Melissa Nasia. These presentations are sponsored by the Lopus Library History Collections and by the Department of Bioethics and Interdisciplinary Studies at the Brody School of Medicine. Today's presentation is Dr. Philippe Ricord, The History of Syphilis and the Art of Human Inoculations. Our presenter is John Papalas, MD, and Dr. Papalas has been in private practice in pathology for about 2.5 years.
But thank you all for coming today. My name is John Papalas. I'm a pathologist here in Greenville, and I want to thank again Melissa for allowing me to present. I'll be speaking about the 19th century French physician, Dr. Philippe Ricord, and his contributions to the field of venereal disease research, specifically using the technique of inoculations. The first part of this talk will be largely historical, and then I'll discuss Dr. Ricord. I'd like to start off with a quote of his. And I can do this in a French accent if you want me to. I can try. Really? Okay. All right. Whoever has taken pains to study syphilitic disease without question has found that no disease is so ill-defined and no diagnosis so uncertain. The only conclusion we can arrive at is that the diagnosis of syphilis is not only difficult, but impossible. This was Dr. Ricord's professional raison d'etre and his ultimate justification for advancing the technique of inoculation. Let me also start by making a few disclosures. I'm not a historian or a scholar. I'm a pathologist specializing in the diagnosis of skin disease. Much of the material in this talk has been summarized from books and articles. Many of these books, because their international copyright has expired, have been digitalized and are freely available to anyone with access to the internet. Here are a couple of examples. Secondly, most of the sources I used were originally published in French, principally the works from Dr. Ricord, and have been translated into English. It is mostly from these English translations that I consulted and I will be quoting from. Although it was somewhat naive, it was not for lack of ambition that I first consulted the original French texts. After working with a retired French professor, Mademoiselle Papalas, in an attempt to translate some of Ricord's works, I realized two things. One, it would take an extremely long time, and two, I know extremely little French, and as such, I'm not remotely qualified to translate anything. But pictures are worth 1,000 words, as the saying goes, and anyone on the planet, regardless of what language you speak, can recognize some meaning conveyed in various images. And most of these images are from his atlas. This illustration is from the atlas he published in 1851, excuse me. But before Ricord, physicians, here's another one of his patients, would have had a difficult time precisely defining this patient's disease. It is, in fact, syphilis, but it resembles advanced gonorrhea. This patient was accurately diagnosed and treated thanks to the technique of inoculations developed by Philippe Ricord. His aims were manifold and his energy seemingly limitless. In fact, it gave way to quite a bit of pride and conceit, which, lucky for us, is openly conveyed in his writings. His style of writing was not typical of medical writing for his time, and some of his contemporaries criticized him for it. But I don't think he cared. By weighing his life's work, we can surmise that Dr. Ricord's major contributions to venereal disease research were the following: to definitively differentiate syphilis from gonorrhea, to demystify the natural history of syphilis, that is, to formally codify the stages which syphilis progresses through, and 3, to show both the great potential and possible disastrous consequences of taking material from a syphilitic lesion and injecting it somewhere else. That's the practice of inoculations. While his flamboyant style and grandiose manner in part caused him to be viewed cynically by his peers, it was, however, nonetheless an extension of his personality and part of what made him a brilliant man. But before we get too deep into the nostalgia and the story of Dr. Ricord and syphilis, let me provide just a little bit of contemporary context. Syphilis remains a major threat, with tens of millions of new cases being diagnosed every year. The southeastern United States is a relative hotbed for syphilis. This is an epidemiologic map published by the Centers for Disease Control in 2012, showing documented cases of syphilis in North Carolina by county. The red areas represent counties with a relatively high disease density. It gives a new meaning to the term red state. The great William Osler presciently warned, this is Dr. Osler, presciently warned that syphilis will be in your community, and it will manifest a range of symptoms mimicking any known or every known disease. At my practice, I was given a biopsy, and I believed I was looking at a case of cutaneous lupus erythematosus. I was actually looking at a case of syphilis, and I had no idea. This is, I apologize for not having perspective. This is from a skin biopsy. It's a picture of a confirmatory test that I sent off to California to be performed, and I didn't realize the patient probably had syphilis until the dermatologist came and said, "Hey, do you think he could have syphilis?" and sent it off, and sure enough. The resolution isn't great, but these small spirochetes, these images, you can kind of see these little corkscrew type organisms here. This is a very high power electron micrograph or microscope image from these corkscrew shaped bacteria. This is Treponema pallidum, the causative agent of syphilis. So the disease is in our midst. Just saw a case of it not too long ago. But where do syphilis's origins lie? Or more directly, as Dr. Holcomb asks in the title of his 1937 book, "Who gave the world syphilis?" And it wasn't Miley Cyrus. Before I transition, though, I need to state one more caveat. I prepared this talk specifically to avoid addressing at any sufficient length the subject of syphilis's origin. This has been studied for hundreds of years, resulting in volumes of topically relevant and interesting material. In fact, just the other day, I searched on a humanities database the key phrases syphilis and history, and over 22,000 items or hits came up. So it is perhaps the most written about area in medical historiography, and it remains, in my opinion, very unsettled. So while a more detailed review of the history of syphilis is perhaps a topic for another meeting, we can, however, visit several important points on the timeline of syphilis, which will bring us up to Dr. Ricord and the 19th century Paris. There are various traditions or disciplines that attempt to answer the question of who gave the world syphilis. One tradition is the printed or textual tradition, which attempts to establish what the oldest hard copy printed evidence of syphilis is. While this may seem like a foolproof approach to answering this question, there are two serious hurdles to overcome. One, the word syphilis was not always used for this disease. There are many names for it. There have been many names for it prior to modern times or contemporary times. It was called the French disease by the Spanish, Italians, and Germans. It was called the Italian disease by the French, and so on, and so on, and so on. So deciding on what to look for in terms of a printed word is important. The second issue, which is less tangible but perhaps more difficult to overcome, If we assume for the purposes of this talk that Treponema pallidum, the organism we just saw, is in fact the germ responsible for what we think was the first wave of syphilis to reach a world capable of writing about it hundreds of years ago, then we have to somehow reconcile this observation with the fact that the disease we see in Pitt County today is completely different from it clinically. So, all that aside, where do we first encounter this disease in writing? Venetian military physicians may have been the first to describe the new disease after encountering infected mercenary soldiers returning to France after the Battle of Fornovo in 1495 as part of the Italian Wars of 1494. There is Fornovo between Parma and Genoa. It was mentioned that year. These doctors described soldiers as having painful fits and progressive pustules. It was also mentioned that year in a mandate issued by the Emperor Maximilian at one of the less famous diets of worms. Seizing on an opportunity to please the emperor, humanists of the time published material describing the new disease as a scourge from God, similar to other diseases, sent to destroy the enemies of the Emperor Maximilian. This is probably the earliest pictorial description of the disease. We see here the Holy Infant Jesus on the left on Virgin Mary's lap being represented as a virtual syphilis Gatling gun, hurling down syphilis-laced arrows on the world's first sufferers. On Mary's right side, represented by the Habsburg eagle, the Habsburg dynasty, and perhaps Emperor Maximilian stand proudly immune to the new and terrifying Holy Scourge. A modified version of this image soon appeared, one depicting a gentler Jesus transmitting rays of health and healing upon the syphilitic sufferers. This image, interestingly enough, was reproduced in the front matter of Ricord's 1851 book on syphilis case reports. By 1496, both the first case history of the disease and works whose main theme was syphilis would be published. Many more descriptions would follow as the 15th century came to a close. Note also the emergence of the association of the emergence of the printing press with the emergence of this new disease in Europe. Excuse me. The beginning of the 1500s saw no break in the momentum of printed material on syphilis. Autobiographical accounts emerged, representing important landmarks in both social and medical understanding of the disease. Mercury would be described as a potential treatment, but this therapeutic approach, almost from its inception, had its skeptics. One such skeptic who warned those of the plague-like side effects of mercury's injudicious application was the brilliant Spanish physician Gaspar Torella. I think we can all agree that he was quite ahead of his time, for modern pharmacology has confirmed his and other suspicions of the horrific toxicity associated with quicksilver. However, being the compassionate physician that he was, he thoughtfully offered other remedies so as not to let his patients suffer without hope. That's what we all need, is hope. The Torella cure, as some have called it, consisted of the following. Once the penile ulcer appears, and I'm not going to do his Spanish accent, but once the penile ulcer appears, one must scrub the lesion vigorously with soft soap. Simple enough. Next, the patient can choose from one of two treatment options based upon their personal preference. In the first option, the patient was ordered to flay alive and freshly pluck a chicken and wrap it around his infected member. If the patient did not find this option agreeable, or if they were amphibiophiles, the patient had the option of placing his infected genital into a still-living frog which had been cut into two halves. It is not hard to imagine the cynicism that arose in educated patients. François Rabelais, himself a doctor and the author of Gargantua and Pantagruel, suggested that perhaps due to these types of treatments, the patient's best bet on getting healthy was simply to laugh it off. I have a picture of Francois. Moving rapidly through the rest of the 1500s and 1600s, we see the emergence of theories outside of the religious to explain the disease's origins. The word syphilis is born, although it was not to be used synonymously with the disease until many years later. The chronicity of the disease is recognized, moral and social attitudes to those with the disease harden, and patients become quarantined and institutionalized. The 1700s mark a very important century, if not only for the advancement of medicine, especially in the field of surgery, but for the history of syphilis. Around 1723, a physician and professor of chemistry at the University of Montpellier, one Anton Didier, proposed that syphilis was caused by tiny egg-laying worms and not by some corrosive or degenerative agent, which was the popular theory at the time. This was a radical break from the humoral theory of disease, which was still, while still dominant, was probably in early decline. Jean Astruc, a giant name in the history that we're breezing over, was also a professor at Montpellier in Paris. In this book, published in 1736, one of his many contributions, he not only references some 600 syphilis-related works, but more importantly, he advances the theory of the American or Caribbean origin of the disease. Although popular cultural views would lag behind, we see now that medical theories were attempting to shift to a more rational explanation for the origin of the disease. The latter half of the 1700s is punctuated by the achievements of John Hunter, a prominent Scottish physician and surgeon. His matured theories on venereal disease were in part summarized in his 1786 book, simply titled A Treatise on the Venereal Disease. Note the definite article, the, before venereal disease. Hunter was the most famous and formidable champion of the unicist theory of venereal disease, believing that gonorrhea and syphilis were essentially different manifestations of a single disease process. He was very influential, and his contributions extend well beyond this particular area of medicine. William Osler eponymously honors Hunter's achievements in this field by calling a syphilitic ulcer the Hunterian chancre. The 1700s came to a close with Hunter and his followers on top. But there was mounting dissent to his theories, with some continuing to argue that syphilis and gonorrhea were indeed different diseases. It would take more than 50 years for this most important distinction to be essentially resolved, and that would be done in large part by Dr. Ricord. Philippe Ricord was born in 1800 in Baltimore, Maryland. His family had immigrated from Marseille, France, largely to escape the reign of terror associated with the aftermath of the French Revolution. Ricord attended a special school in New York established for French refugee children. Due in part to his father's early passing, he finished his primary education in the home setting. During an excursion to Canada with one of his older brothers, he met a French naturalist with political connections in France. So at the age of 20, he set off for France with a guaranteed position as a curator of botanical and zoological specimens for a natural science museum in Paris. After arriving, he quickly began to take advantage of his bilingual background and started to earn extra income both translating and teaching English. Like his grandfather before him, Philippe had decided to pursue a career in medicine. He was soon granted admission to the Academy of Val-de-Grâce to begin his study of medicine. Beautiful building. He soon transitioned to the Hôtel Dieu, another hospital, regarded as the oldest one in Paris, originally founded in 651. In 1822, he passed an examination granting him an internship and the opportunity to study under the Baron Guillaume Dupterin, known to us for the contractures which eponymously bear his name, but he was also Napoleon Bonaparte's hemorrhoid doctor. In an early and daring display of his non-conforming nature, Philippe Ricord publicly disputed his mentor's claims of being the first surgeon to create an artificial anus. Ricord pointed to American reports of similar procedures which predated Dupterin's claims. Obviously, Dupterin was none too happy, and he promptly dismissed his brilliant yet difficult student. Ricord finished his medical training at the Petit-Salpêtrière Hospital under an equally well-known surgeon, Dr. Lisfranc. Lisfranc's name is well known to football fans and players, for his name is associated with a particular type of serious football injury. Ricord received his degree under Lisfranc in 1826. After a few years in private practice outside of Paris, in 1831 he was offered an appointment at the Hôpital de Midi, which was a venereal disease hospital. He accepted the position even though he was not their first choice, and it would be there that he would remain for over a quarter century. This hospital was, again, for men stricken with venereal disease, an area up to that point in his training Ricord had no particular special exposure. The position was too prestigious, however, to pass on, and he quickly set to work. So at the time of his appointment, the state of medical knowledge related to venereal disease was in disarray and can be summarized as follows. 1, many physicians viewed, again, venereal disease as a single entity concept which could manifest in a variety of ways. 2, there were few rigorously applied and systematic experimental approaches to the study of syphilis. 3, the modern tripartite division of the stages of syphilis were not formatively accepted. 4, chancroid, a sexually transmitted infection mimicking primary syphilis, yet caused by a totally unrelated organism, was not clearly understood. And 5, the practice of taking fluid or pus from a venereal lesion and injecting it somewhere else was a technique that was being experimented with. 2 years after Ricord's appointment at the hospital, he was publishing papers on venereal disease in women. A few years later, he had formulated and published his theoretical framework for studying syphilis. A few years after this, in 1938, Ricord would publish a groundbreaking book on syphilis, which would be translated into several languages. This work, some imperfections aside, would represent the medical and scientific foundations of our modern understanding of the disease. So how was he able to accomplish this? Well, this monograph entitled A Practical Treatise on Venereal Disease, or Critical and Experimental Research on Inoculation applied to the study of these affections, is divided into several sections. In the first section, Ricord sets the stage by sardonically attacking his opponent's theories, in many instances accusing them of being dishonest and ignorant. I may note here that Ricord was a brilliant and entertaining and even downright funny lecturer, always commanding an audience during a large audience during his clinical rounds and didactic sessions. This quality certainly comes out in his writings. In terms of his attacking his opponents, he really focuses on a few unlucky individuals, a certain Dr. Brou and Dr. Caron being some of his favorite targets. He says, "We may confidently assert that Dr. Brou did not know how to appreciate the circumstances under which he made his experiments. My research will soon prove that either Brou did not know how to properly set up his experiments, or he was not candid with the results. I should rather believe the former of these suppositions, considering the small number of experiments he made and the long intervals between them. As for Dr. Caron, his arguments are so vague and unfounded that they do not deserve a serious refutation." This is representative of his style. It was not only criticized, but feared when encountered at live medical academy meetings. Later in the monograph, Ricord provides some historical context for the use of inoculations. With respect to the evolution of venereal disease research, this technique, or at least some version of it, had been used since at least 1786. Hunter references several uses of it in his treatise. It was not applied systematically, though. The 50 years or so between Hunter and Ricord's reports on the use of inoculations to study venereal disease, reports are more or less anecdotal, and with several exceptions, lacked formal organization. Ricord recognized this, and realizing the potential utility of the technique, started to use it. He believed that the controlled and systematic use of inoculations could be used as a means of modernizing venereal disease research. He did not jump into this practice feet first, though. He describes his failed attempts at pursuing venereal disease research from other angles. Animal experimentation and animal models of disease were important in the 19th century. Creating an animal model of syphilis, however, proved difficult. Ricord himself tried and concluded that it was not practical. Ricord also experimented with other forms of bodily secretions. He writes about his involvement in the debate about the type of acid found in vaginal secretions and its relationship to the communicability of syphilis. Ricord argued that the particular acid he thought was found in these secretions had a potential experimental value. He laments, however, that it is difficult to detect this acid when vaginal fluid can only be obtained in such small quantities. This last remark on the deficiency of material will doubtless surprise those who are familiar with Paris. It's in his book. Imagine reading that in a standard medical text today. Finally, and most important, to the integrity of historical reputation, Ricord placed a great deal of importance on medical ethics. Despite what was happening around him, including techniques used by some of his most aggressive competitors, Ricord objected to potentially infecting healthy or unwitting subjects. I wonder what he would have thought about the Tuskegee experiments, which concluded in the early 1970s. It wasn't that long ago. Ricord insisted on informing his patients of their condition and what he thought. Oliver Wendell Holmes said that there was no physician more empathetic. Ricord believed that with inoculations, he could combine experiment with diagnosis and treatment, and I believe in this regard he falls on the right side of history. So what exactly are inoculations? Well, the technique consisted of obtaining fluid, here shown from a draining lymph node, or scrapings from a primary syphilitic ulcer, and loading it onto a syringe or putting it on the head of a lancet and puncturing the skin so that the material is deposited beneath the epidermis but not deeper than the subcutaneous tissue. There is a regular and consistent progression from pustule to ulcer, and if this is observed, then a diagnosis of syphilis is rendered. Ricord describes several contexts and the reason why, according to him, gonorrhea would not produce this progression and an ulcer. Ricord describes several contexts in which the use of inoculations may be beneficial. Again, we must keep in mind that his inoculations are auto-inoculations and never inoculations between people. The first and most important use for the purpose of, uses for the purpose of differentiating gonorrhea from syphilis. According to the Ricord method, gonorrhea never inoculates so as to result in a pustule and then a syphilic ulcer. Simple local irritation is pretty much the only finding one will encounter if they inoculate gonorrheal discharge, but never a pustule followed by an ulcer. Those who claim to have inoculated gonorrhea and observed a subsequent syphilitic lesion were simply missing a hidden chancre or misdiagnosing gonorrhea for syphilis. Ricord stood on pretty firm ground here because he helped to revolutionize the use of the speculum in the context of the physical exam. for venereal disease patients. He writes about this quite a bit and describes female patients who are misdiagnosed and hence mistreated because of errors made during the physical exam. The error of confusing gonorrhea with syphilis also lies at the heart of the apocryphal story of Hunter inoculating himself with gonorrhea pus tainted with the excretions from a hidden syphilitic ulcer. The second use for inoculations, which Ricord describes with some hesitation, is for the purposes of treatment. As late as the end of the 18th century, there were some physicians who believed that if one could combine or link an obstinate or incurable disease to one that can be cured, then employing the known effective treatment for the second disease will cure both of them. While Ricord does acknowledge that there may be some narrow application for this technique, he essentially states that only patients with known intractable advanced syphilis would potentially qualify for such a therapy. And he ends his discussion of this by strongly cautioning those who are considering its use. The third use for inoculations is for prognostication. He states that inoculations are of great value as regards the prognosis of the patient, for every individual who has had inoculable symptoms remains positively susceptible to general infection and liable afterwards to symptoms of constitutional syphilis. Remember, it was Ricord who in large part formalized the 3 stages of syphilis. And here he states that inoculations can be used to predict potential disease progression. The final and probably most important use for inoculations is one which is only to be used in the gravest emergencies. He states, "Whoever sees men as they are in the office of the practitioner without that disguise of morality which society requires must admit that there are circumstances in which sexual intercourse becomes indispensable, and if it is denied, it causes pain of the most serious moral and social kind. In these serious and urgent circumstances, we can use inoculations to deliver a clean bill of health." In addition to the use of inoculations in these types of social emergencies, Ricord also makes a case for the use of inoculations in legal contexts, such as rape, where both parties have some form of venereal disease. Here again, Ricord does not reference specific cases, yet with his very busy private practice, I suspect that statements such as these, those that invoke a broader application of medical research, are derived from seeing patients from a variety of social backgrounds. In addition to his work at the public hospital, Ricord maintained a very busy and lucrative private clinic. His clinic was located on the Rue de Tournon, which is an address of one of the most prestigious streets in Paris, adjacent to Luxembourg Palace, which we see at the end of the street here, which is the current seat of the French Senate. Here's a modern view of this beautiful street. There are 2 uses of inoculations which Ricord vigorously objects to, the second being potentially much worse than the first. The first is the use of inoculations. Which have been mixed with some form of experimental agent in the hopes of ascertaining the potential efficacy of that particular agent as a therapy. The theory being, if the inoculation does not take, then the chemical substance added to the inoculum could be used as potential treatment. Ricord essentially dismisses this technique because he does not trust others to reliably diagnose syphilis for the purpose of experimentation. That is, a less competent syphilographer may inadvertently use gonorrheal discharge for this purpose, which would produce a negative result and hence confound the results. The more serious objection that Ricord raises is actually against a modified form of inoculation. It is in essence a type of inoculation, but in practical terms, it is an attempt at prophylaxis or vaccination. The name for this practice was syphilization. Ricord's opposition to and condemnation of the systematic application of syphilization was strong. He states, "Dishonesty and the speculation of quacks, which continually make the most sacred science subservient to the purposes..." I'm losing my accent. You know what? I'm going to just read this quote. I don't even know where that was going. So this is him. "Dishonesty and the speculation of quacks, which continually make the most sacred science subservient to their purposes, have availed themselves of the inoculation of syphilis, and like every other road to success and celebrity, have misused it. In this case, it is apparent that inoculation neither has been nor can be employed like that of a vaccine to prevent disease, and it has only been used to prove the efficacy of any preservative." These words predict a very intense and public battle between Dr. Ricord and one of his adversaries, Dr. Joseph Aussies Turenne, that would ensue several decades later. Syphilization and its discontents, as well as the debate and ultimate ruling against it by the prestigious French Academy of Medicine, is a topic deserving of its own talk. But here, as a staunch opponent to the use of inoculation for what he deemed harmful at best and socially catastrophic at worst, Ricord stands firm and threw the entire might of his reputation against such practices. At the age of 60, Ricord retired from his obligations at the public hospital service and dedicated himself to his private practice. He died in 1889. With the death of one of the greatest practitioners and staunchest defenders of syphilitic inoculations, so went the technique, as it too had run out of steam. It did not help that before his death, Ricord would finally have to admit professionally that he was wrong about the infectious nature of secondary syphilis, an admission that hastened the demise of his influence. During the ensuing 30 years, major advances included the application of statistics by one of his prized students, Alfred Fournier, resulting in significant epidemiological advances in the understanding of the disease. Another one of his students, Léon Bassereux, would differentiate chancroid from syphilis. Treponema pallidum, the causative agent of syphilis, was characterized, and arsphenamine, or compound 606, was developed by the eventual Nobel laureate Paul Ehrlich. It would take several more decades until penicillin was applied as the definitive treatment, but the revolution in medicine had already occurred. Ricord was an important transitional figure in the history of medicine. He represented a new breed of physician, one who was willing to part ways with the humoral tradition established by Galen 1,600 years before him. Ricord and others like him were stepping into a void of sorts by breaking ties with this Galenic tradition. His contributions to the understanding of disease and his flamboyant style, to me, really make him stand out as a man of genius. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was really a lot of fun and very
Good.
interesting.
That's
So I was thinking, how did his work parallel Jenner's with smallpox? How does that fit?
Well, it came after Jenner's work, and Jenner's work biased everybody. People believed that they could, apply that same technique to pretty much every infectious disease. Now, the revolution, Pasteur hadn't come around yet, so they weren't really. They didn't understand, bacteriology wasn't really a science yet. It was coming, it was close. But people believed essentially the syphilization, which was, attempted, was basically modeled after Jenner's work in smallpox vaccination. And that was another one of the reasons they really wanted to develop an animal model. It wasn't necessarily only for studying the disease, but if the idea was if you could kind of have a less virulent form of the disease in an animal, you could take that and use it for vaccination purposes, like the pox vaccination had sort of developed.
Yeah, John, that was very nice. I had a question about the diagnostic use of the inoculations. How does he distinguish between, or how did he distinguish between two populations of syphilitics, one that would respond by making a pustule, and those that had true syphilis and those that had gonorrhea? Was there some point that he was able to tell the difference by another means?
How did he differentiate between, so if he used gonorrhea, for instance, would he been able, so the results were different to him. If he had used gonorrheal, if he had used discharge from somebody who only had gonorrhea, then he wouldn't have seen the development of the ulcer. Maybe I didn't understand the question. I don't think I understood your question. I'm sorry.
Let's suppose you had a population of 100 people that had syphilis, and you did that experiment, and some produce a pustule and some do not. You could erroneously say that half of them had gonorrhea, or you can say, okay, maybe not all syphilitics have that same response.
Yeah, I mean, so a big issue was this chancroid, and that was a disease which hadn't yet been characterized. And I honestly don't know, if that resulted in, what that resulted in. If some fluid was taken from a patient with chancroid, if it would kind of progress like these quote unquote syphilitic inoculations would. But as I read this, some of it just kind of seems a little fishy because, there was never any confirmatory. In my mind, we confirm infections now through the use of cultures. None of that was done. So, in fact, you can't even culture syphilis really today, I don't think. But whether or not, how accurate he was in differentiating big populations, most of his, he didn't do studies, using, kind of methods we use today with, different groups of patients and blinding the researchers to the details of the populations. He basically treated hundreds of patients and described each of these patients, in kind of case report format. But he didn't use the population statistics that you're referencing. His student Alfred Fournier did, and he was able to kind of answer, I think, some of those questions. But there were a lot of limitations to his technique in terms of applying it to studies like that, I think.
A reminder that we have some refreshments back there, and we want to get people to sign in on the sign-in sheet. And I'm not even certain where it currently is. Oh, okay, so we know where it is. Any other questions? I saw another hand or two earlier.
Thank you, Dr. Papalas, for a very interesting presentation. My question is, did Columbus and or his crew bring syphilis to the New World?
Well, if I could answer that question, I'd be writing books. So that's a big question. And in my mind, it's not. I don't know. There's no. I don't think there's. Some people are very, strong believers in that, and the timing works out well with Columbus's second voyage. I think 1490 something coming back. His troops being part of troops that went to sort of support this army in Naples, which when the French troops came down to in the siege of Naples in 1493, they basically abandoned the city and it was just left open. And so these French troops plundered the city, and they think at that point may have encountered syphilis, and then spread it as they a lot of these were mercenary troops, returning back to throughout Europe, and may have spread it to a continent which had not yet been exposed to the disease, and that's why it was so people were dying of it, and it was just terrible. It makes sense, but it's the evidence is I think there are other forms of not syphilis, but treponematosis. There are several related diseases with the bacteria is basically essentially the same bacteria, but it doesn't cause syphilis, and those diseases are endemic throughout the world. So why the venereal form being kind of on the scene for the first time in early modern Europe, right when you're getting into the 1500s, the printing press had a lot to do with it. I think. It was being popularized, but whether or not Columbus brought it, I don't know. One of the main kind of, an important defender of that theory, if not originator, claimed to have seen Columbus's patients, but at the time Columbus returned on a second voyage, this physician was only 7 years old. So he ended up writing about this like 30 or 40 years later. And so, whether or not he knew really what he was talking about is debatable. But it's, it's a story. It may be. I don't know.
This is an observation. I think recent data from hybridization, DNA hybridization, there is no evidence there was any treponemal in Europe or Asia before 1492, which leads strength to that hypothesis.
Yeah, I mean that's they're both sides. I think have strong points. And are you talking about Treponema pallidum venereal, or are you talking about yaws?
The earliest case in Europe
of what?
or Asia
of what?
Of a body that has DNA that hybridizes to treponemes is a.
Oh, treponemes in general.
Yes.
Okay.
Any of them. a lady in Naples that died like 1510. But if there is any bodies available for hybridization, we'd be happy to do tests.
Yeah, well, I don't know what the reliability or what the, you're talking about DNA that's hundreds of years old. I mean, that's a pretty, I couldn't do research on tissue samples preserved in formalin and embedded in paraffin that were only, 5 years old or 10 years old, because the quality of the DNA, is just so poor. So, I think trying to answer that question definitively, I think those are important studies, but trying to answer that question with samples, biological samples that are very old is, you have to just take that in consideration.
Thank you, John.